Amen. Thank you, Dan. It's not lost on me this morning that I'm going to talk about peace and anxiety. And in a way that I wouldn't normally, I was having a little fret through the service. And worship band, I'm so sorry that I took your communion things away. I looked at the table. I saw it had been there since the beginning and thought, oh no, somebody's forgotten that. And I'm going to need that table. And I took charge of something I didn't need to take charge of because everybody knows how the service runs, except for Deborah when anxiety takes over. It's not lost on me. Morning, if you don't know me, I'm Deborah. I'm on the team here at Central Vineyard, and it's always a great joy and privilege to come and share the word with you. It's not quite our last week in Philippians. We've got baptisms next week, and then Dan is going to bring it in to land on the 21st of July. He's nodding, that's good, in time for the summer holidays. I'm just going to pray, and then we'll get straight to it. Do I need to stand somewhere else because I'm feeding back? No? Okay, cool. Father, I want to thank you for your church. I want to thank you for your presence here in this place and your word. Lord, ask that my words would glorify you and be fruitful for you and your kingdom. Anything of you, I pray it would fall away to nothing. In the name of your precious Son, our risen Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen. So today's passage, I kind of feel like it's the crown jewel of Philippians, so I'm really delighted to talk to you about it this morning. It's all about where to find peace and what to do with anxiety. You can see why I got anxious talking about anxiety. It's not surprising. Anxiety can be a loaded term, and sometimes in our culture it can be over-indexed. And by that I mean we can say, for example, lost my phone last week and absolutely had a total anxiety attack. Or I think about talking to a room full of people I don't know, and anxiety just rises up in me. Now, they're just examples of over-indexing the term anxiety. For some people, though, that can be their very real experience of anxiety. The flip side, of course, is that anxiety can also be hugely underestimated. It can go mostly unnoticed and invisible on the outside, while inside your chest is tightening and your breath is just getting really short. Your heart begins to race and your head might get dizzy. Without asking anyone to say, it would be unusual to be in a room this size and to have nobody here that has never had an anxiety of experience. Let me rephrase that another way. It is numerically impossible for this room to be filled with people who have not ever experienced anxiety. And I don't need anyone to signal that. Anxiety can come from a lot of places. It can be a certain name appearing on your phone. It can be just before you check your bank balance in the morning, if you need to check your bank balance. It can be walking into a room like this, not knowing where to sit, maybe not knowing everybody can actually cause anxiety. And it can take a lot of forms. It can be an occasional malaise like I experienced this morning, or it can be chronic and debilitating. It could be that you have a diagnosed or even an undiagnosed anxiety disorder. And if that's so, I just want you to hear that you are cared for, that this is a safe place. Your pathway to freedom doesn't make you exempt from the promises of God. If you experience anxiety, whether it's diagnosed or not, whether it's chronic and debilitating, or whether it's momentary and fleeting, your anxiety does not preclude you from the promises of God. And your path to freedom hopefully will involve God, but may also involve counselling, medication, and some good support. But please, please hear me. If anxiety is present in your life, God is still very much with you. It may be that you might be thinking, do you know what, Deborah? Anxiety is a reality of my life. And you're thinking, do you know what? I'm just going to lean out a bit because I don't know if I want to hear another talk on how you can be a Christian and, you know, God's the God of peace and anxiety. Or it may even be that this morning that you have never had a problematic experience with anxiety. And if that's the case, it's probably quite likely that you know somebody who has. And in usual Deborah style, I've done some research before my talk. Not to be a negative Nelly, let's have some stats. These stats are on anxiety only. They don't include depression and stress. And they're from October 2023, so they're fairly recent. In that survey, 40% of adults reported feeling anxious. 40% of adults surveyed reported feeling anxious. of those surveyed, 45% admitted to feeling too ashamed to discuss their anxiety. And over a third, 34%, report feeling anxious most of the time and that they do not think that they are coping with their anxiety. These numbers are taken from KindMind, which is an organisation that uses science to study wellness and to help organisations, employers and employees understand wellness. 40% of adults report feeling anxious. That's nearly half. Nearly half the people in this room report feeling anxious, and of those, half report feeling too ashamed to talk about it. That's not really okay. Anxiety seems to have a hold on us, and it has a hold on the world. And I did a little bit more research. I've got a Kindle, which is magnificent at bedtime, because it means we can turn the light off, and some people can go straight to sleep because that's their gift, whereas others need to wind down, and I wind down with my Kindle. So I thought, I wonder what is the most highlighted quote on the Kindle. What's the most highlighted book? In the top 10, can anybody guess? It's up already. No, it's fine. Stick it back, Rosie. I shouldn't really have been surprised to see that the number one highlighted book is the Holy Bible, the English Standard Version. That's the one I read. It's my favourite translation. And Steve Jobs and The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games. I mean, it's a great story. Number 3. And then the One Year Bible, New Living Translation, closely followed by the ESV Study Bible. So, it's like I can't count this morning. 1, 2, 3 of the top 6 books, highlighted books on Kindle e-readers, are the Bible. We tell the stat all the time that the Bible is the best-selling book ever, and it's not included in the bestseller list because nothing else would ever be on the bestseller list if we counted the Bible. Apparently, if you're a Kindle reader, it's also the most highlighted book. And the number one highlighted passage in the entire Bible, highlighted more than the Lord's Prayer, more than the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, more even than the global favourite, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, highlighted even more than that is our passage today. It's Philippians 4. Shall we turn to Philippians 4? There it is. There's some New Testaments on the landing. If you would like to take one with you, we'd love to bless you with that. If you've got your Bible on your phone or even your paper Bible, feel free to follow along. Keep your finger on it because I'm going to talk about the passage as well. But I'm going to read from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 to 9. I'm going to read it from the NIV, not the ESV. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. It's kind of a life-changing promise, that, isn't it? That we can exchange rejoicing for sorrow. We can exchange our fear and get gratitude. That we can get peace in the place of anxiety. And yet, how many of us actually live that way? I'm a living example of teacher, teach thyself. How many of us live without anxiety? Why are so many of us who follow Jesus unhappy or hanging on by a thread? Why are we struggling in our relationships? Why is it that sometimes things just seem a little bit disappointing? And if it's not true for your whole life, at some times it's going to be true for a corner of your life. Why, when we've been offered abundant lives, are so many of us living half-hearted? And this is what Paul is addressing in this part of his letter. Unlike some of his other letters, Paul is not rebuking heresy or idolatry. He's writing to encourage the church in Philippi, to commend them and to use them as an example to other churches. They've been extravagant in their care for Paul, and despite their poverty, they've given generously to the other needs of other churches, without being asked even. As a church, they walk in faithfulness to Jesus and their devotion to others. So Paul is writing to them at a time when pressure is beginning to mount for them. And they're beginning to be oppressed. And as Pete mentioned last week, there's division inside their own church body. I'm not going to try and say those names either. Euodia, Syntyche. It's not going well. They've been called out in the letter. And so actually, Paul is writing to give them access to peace, to give them access to abundant living, to a wholehearted life right in the midst of all of that persecution, all of that oppression, and all of that difficulty. And Paul begins his passage with 3 instructions. He says, number 1, rejoice. Number 2, be gentle. And number 3, do not be anxious. I used to have a boss who'd say to me when I was spiraling, yeah, don't worry. He had a Yorkshire accent. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. Don't worry. That never worked. Just a little tip, if somebody in your life is anxious, telling them to don't worry doesn't work. However, Paul has got some instructions, and the ordering of his instructions matter. Before Paul addresses their anxiety, he tells the Philippians to rejoice in God and to be gentle to others. What does he mean by this? Well, to rejoice in God means to take our eyes off our circumstances and to fix them on Jesus, to delight in his character and to remember his track record of faithfulness, who he is and what he has done. And the Philippian church had reason to rejoice. Their church had begun when the manifest presence of God turned up. They were worshipping, and the prison doors opened wide, and it was built on the grace of a God who kept prisoners in their cells to save a guard from committing suicide. Grace and mercy poured out right at the genesis of their church. Whilst they had little financially, they had much to rejoice in the faithfulness of God. God was going to break into Europe from their church. It was a really important place, and God was really good to them and faithful to them. So Paul is reminding them that God has been so good to them, to remember their story and remember their reasons to rejoice. Last week, Martin and I worshipped with Storehouse and in Northampton East, and Martin shared his testimony with everyone. I'm not going to rehash it, and I'm not going to share mine because we haven't got time. It's been a while since either of us has shared a full testimony the way that Martin did last week. And I hadn't read it beforehand, and he hadn't talked to me much about it beforehand. So I sat just listening to Martin present this wonderful story, describing the ups and downs of a life lived with Jesus. And as Martin's wife, it was really good to sit there and to be reminded of God's goodness and faithfulness in our lives. To hear spoken out loud all the examples of God's hand holding us and guiding us, protecting us down the years. So as I prepared for this morning, I want to give you some homework. I'm not going to mark it. But I want to invite you to take a few moments this morning or after I finish talking or at some point with a cup of tea to just, or a coffee, whatever you, don't want to be too dictatorial, choose your own beverage. Take a few moments and make a few notes about your own story. To get out those milestones, those reasons to rejoice in God. And I'm actually quite serious, because sometimes we can just get caught in walking forwards and taking a step and just existing. And so we forget all those reasons to rejoice. And I'm going to give you a little bit of extra homework, extra credit. Have a little pray then about who you can share that with, because testimony builds faith. I sat listening to Martin and my spirit rose. So who can you share your testimony with? And your spirit will rise and their spirit will rise. So that's instruction number 1 from Paul. Instruction number 2 is this: to be gentle. Paul says to his readers, let your gentleness be evident to all. He doesn't just mean to be polite or courteous, although that is a good place to start. The Greek that Paul uses here doesn't really have an English equivalent, but scholars and commentators agree that the word contains an element of selflessness, of not insisting on one's own rights. It's a total emptying of oneself. Modern synonyms, which are kind of the closest to this meaning, include benevolence, wishing the good of the other, operating solely for the good of the recipient, and kindness, generosity, and magnanimity, that one. In the face of your enemy, such as the Philippians were facing at the time, it meant a gentle non-retaliation. How often when somebody says something incorrect to you, about you, or about somebody that you know, but particularly about you, do you long to advocate for yourself, to stand up for yourself, to put them right? Something I've been learning is to let people be wrong about me, to not necessarily advocate for myself, to just gentle non-retaliation. I don't always get it right. How many of us in the face of opposition, or when we come face to face with an enemy, can let our gentleness be evident to all? Another piece of homework. Don't worry, I'm not going to mark this one either. But this week, as you go through this week, see if you can notice how many times do you respond to somebody with gentle non-retaliation? Or do you respond with defensiveness or even challenge? And then maybe at the end of the week, have a little pray and ask Jesus to help you grow in that gentleness. I genuinely believe we can all grow in gentleness. We've all got space to grow. Now, those are two really good instructions, aren't they? However, they're only possible because of what follows. We can't do those in our own strength. We can't do those by ourselves. We can't just rejoice arbitrarily, and we can't just be non-gentle arbitrarily. It really matters that it's really important that we remember the Lord is near. The Lord is near. Paul goes on, before he says, do not be anxious, he gives his reader the solid reminder that the Lord is near. That's the only way we're going to be able to lay down our rights. That's the only way we're going to be able to respond with gentle non-retaliation. It's if we know we're in the presence of a God who picks those things up as we lay them down. Paul assures the Philippians that they don't actually have to defend themselves under oppression because they already have a defender. God is already on their side. He's already near to them. So he says, be gentle, for the Lord is near. It's not Paul telling the Philippians, God is not Deborah, he's not giving you homework. He's not looking over their shoulder with a scorecard. What he's actually saying is, if you've ever experienced anxiety, it comes with something called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is where you are constantly on super alert for what is happening and where is the danger coming from. The chemicals in your body have risen and your brain is just telling you that you're in danger. And so hypervigilance comes on as a form of protection so that you are ready instantly for that fight or flight mechanism that's trying to keep you safe. Hypervigilance in your day-to-day life is exhausting and it's no way to live. And Paul is saying to the Philippians, you don't need this. Yes, you are surrounded by oppression and you are persecuted by enemies, but you do not need to be hypervigilant. You don't have to be ready to retaliate or to defend. You can relax and give of yourself because God is with you and he is your defender. So we can kind of think of these first two as permissions rather than instructions. And if we do that, then we can reframe them in such a way that says, in the midst of pain, you are allowed to find joy. You can be gentle because you are safe, because God is close. So before reminding them that they do not need to be anxious, Paul has explained why. You can rejoice in the Lord. Be secure. So now our third instruction, do not be anxious about anything. Peace isn't the absence of anxiety. It is the total reorientation of every circumstance in the presence of Jesus. It's called a peace which transcends all understanding because true peace doesn't always change our circumstances. It reorients them in our confidence of who God is. It's called a peace which transcends all understanding because true peace doesn't always change our circumstances. It reorients them in our confidence of who God is. And we saw that in Jesus' time. So the peace that Jesus brought, it went after people's hearts. But actually, Jesus kind of made things a little bit more chaotic as he brought restoration and peace. He restored the sick and the dead to their families. He returned the minds of those who were tormented and the sight of those who were born blind. And yet, in those examples, the same peace that Jesus gave them as he healed them it really complicated their lives. The man who was born blind, he got kicked out of the synagogue for saying that Jesus gave him his sight. Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead after 4 days, like Lazarus was properly dead. After 4 days, Jesus raised him to life. And have a guess what? As soon as he's back to life, the religious leaders and the politicians are trying to pop him straight back in the grave. The people Jesus encountered and healed and to whom he brought priests, their problems didn't always disappear. But in the presence of Jesus, their problems got lighter. Like the presence of Jesus is a zero gravity environment. And all those things that feel heavy in the presence of Jesus, they become really light as they get pulled into the orbit of God. They might still hover around you, but they are no longer going to crush you. They're no longer going to weigh you down. It might still look like chaos on the outside, but on the inside, it can feel like peace. And we saw Jesus' peace in the midst of storms with the disciples more than once. So the first time in Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 to 27, Jesus is sleeping through the storm. Now, I was having a little run through this talk. There was a massive storm where we live on Saturday morning. Did not sleep through that at all. Jesus slept through he's on a boat, small boat, and he's sleeping through the storm. I do pray for sleep like that. That's a prayer I shall continue praying. The disciples wake him as the waves are sweeping over the boat. Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind and waves, and it becomes immediately completely calm. The second time, though, in Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, the disciples have gone ahead. Jesus has gone up the mountain to have a little pray, and then he follows on behind the disciples. And a storm blows up, as it does in that part of the world. They come on really quickly, and they're really violent. And the disciples catch sight of Jesus walking on top of the waves in the middle of a storm, and they are somewhat discombobulated. Unsurprisingly so. Peter, I love Peter's boldness. Peter asked Jesus to command Peter to get out of the boat and cross the waves to Jesus. But when Peter gets out, the reality of the storm literally hits him. Fear arrives and he begins to sink. Jesus calls him up again, and Peter joins Jesus. And Jesus doesn't calm the storm for Peter. They walk back through the storm to the boat. The storm continues. In the midst of it, Jesus is showing Peter, if you keep your eyes on me, if you step over your fear, the storm is not going to overcome you. When they stepped into the boat, then the storm calmed and they worshipped and they said, truly, you are the Son of God. Matthew 8 and Matthew 14, the disciples are scared and anxious, and rightly so. Now, they're not newbies to sailing. They're experienced fishermen, and they know that when that storm comes, it could be fatal for them. They're caught in the midst of this brutal storm that can come on rapidly and be so violent, and yet in one story, Jesus calms the storm, and in the other, his promise is, the storm is not going to overcome you. I wonder if anyone needs to hear that this morning. Maybe there's been a time in your life where Jesus has calmed the storm, where you've prayed that prayer and said, Jesus, I just need you to calm the storm. And he answered that prayer, and another storm has come. And maybe you're wondering why Jesus hasn't answered that prayer to calm the storm. Maybe this morning, Jesus wants to remind you, keep your eyes on me. The storm is not going to overcome you. Paul's invitation to the Philippians was an invitation to not be anxious, to not be full of dread or fear, because the person of peace was with them. In the presence of Jesus, everything shifts. And the reason our Bible contains the text that it contains is because these are the ones that matter. These are the ones that still speak truth to us here today. Paul was absolutely writing to a small gathering of people somewhere on the Ignatian Way, and yet his words, which point to the person of Jesus and the truth about him, they're still relevant and applicable to us here today. 21 centuries later in Northampton, here in central England, 4,000 miles away from where it all happened. We do not need to be full of dread or fear, because the person of peace, Jesus, is with us, each one of us. And because he chooses us and we choose him, in his presence, everything shifts. Now, our passage this morning is broken into two halves, and we've covered that first half, and that promises of the peace of God will guard the Philippians' hearts and minds. At the end of the second half of our passage, there's another promise. Not only can the Philippians have the peace of God, but that peace of God and the God of peace are available to us, to you and me here today. To take hold of peace, we must embrace a life of interior examination, prayer and petition, and taking our thoughts captive. That interior examination is implicit in Paul's instruction to be anxious about nothing. We have to know when and why we're experiencing anxiety. It's not always quite as simple as reading these words and saying, oh, don't be anxious. Okay, that's good. I've got it sorted. That's all I needed to do. It's not how it works. Our emotions have to be acknowledged before we can move through them. And any attempt to dismiss our emotions will only amplify that signal that is telling us that something isn't okay. Eventually, those emotions are going to come out. When they do, it's probably going to be sideways. It's probably going to be quite unpleasant. And it's probably going to be with some people that you don't really want those emotions coming out sideways with. There are some tools that can help you work out how you're feeling. You can Google the emotions wheel, mad, bad, sad, glad, and then it goes out, and you can have a little look. Don't be consumed by this. It's just helpful if you're somebody who thinks, what's going on for me right now in my body? How many of us, without pausing and examining, can actually accurately describe how we're feeling and why? To deny our emotions is to deny a part of our humanity, and that's a part of how God created this. And I just want to anchor this in Scripture, and one of my favourite Psalms, Psalm 139, verses 23 to 24. David says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." The invitation here isn't to disappear into a little self-centric bubble of interior examination. David invites God to search his heart and show him what's inside of it. Who knows your heart better than the one who created it? This is not Project Super Self-Awareness. This is about deeper communion with God. How can you cast your cares on God if you do not know what are your cares? If you're not sure if you're feeling anxious, have a look at how you're responding to what's going on around you. If you're getting really small, you're probably feeling anxious. If you're getting really big, you're probably feeling anxious. You can use these 5 questions. I would suggest taking a picture, if you want to, of this slide. It can help you work out what's going on in a given situation. And again, you don't need to have these 5 questions in front of you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But if there is a situation in your life where something is happening and your body is not feeling great, let's say there's something going on at work. Maybe you felt overlooked. Maybe you felt insignificant. And as a result, the story that you tell yourself is that you're not valued at work. What does the gospel say? The gospel says, my identity is secure, and it is anchored in what God says about me. So therefore, what counterintuitive action is needed? Do I need to die to selfish ambition? Maybe I need to find ways to serve others. This is a hypothetical example, by the way. I don't feel overlooked at work. I have a great job. It's a very small team. It's impossible to feel overlooked. But it is an example, and it's a really helpful tool to just pause and invite God to help you work through what's going on for you. Naming our emotions doesn't give them any more power over us. Sometimes culturally we can be tempted to think if we acknowledge our emotions, they're going to take over, they're going to run rampant, and our emotions are just going to be in control. But the reality is, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he tells us this, he says, we give voice to our hearts, not to be victims or martyrs, but to find freedom from resentment, from anger, from shame or self-loathing that fester inside of us. We have to name it out to get it out. Pretending it's not there doesn't make it go away, it just makes it bigger. So we have to know how we're feeling and why in order to hand it over. And then Paul continues to explain, instead of being anxious, we are in everything to pray and petition, and to do that with thanksgiving. Present our requests to God. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to keep this relatively succinct. You might be tempted to think prayer and petition are the same thing. But actually, I think I've said previously that prayer is coming into the presence of God. And petition is what we do afterwards with our requests. So when we talk about prayer as coming into the presence of God, this is where we invite him to show us what's in our hearts, to examine us. And we see him doing that to the disciples in the storms. He says, why are you so afraid? Why did you doubt? Jesus, he probably knew the answer to that. He's not surprised by anything. So what he's doing there is presenting them with an opportunity for internal examination, to name it out and get it out, so it can be looked at, so it can be dealt with, if necessary, repented of. Sorry, Jesus, I didn't trust that you had my safety. Sorry, Jesus, I thought you were asleep. I thought I was going to drown. And then to find peace. And if that sounds too convenient, right back in Genesis, God does something very similar with Adam and Eve. He says, where are you? He told you you were naked. God probably knew the answers to those questions. And so why is he asking them? He's giving Adam and Eve the opportunity to have a little look and say, do you know what? I don't think I've got that right. This is how I feel. And open up that conversation with God. So our first step is to find intimacy with God. And we always say this on Alpha, intimacy means into me see. Intimacy with God gives him a chance to look inside you. It's all there anyway. It's not a surprise to him. And actually that's when we get deeper and closer with God. And then once we've done that, once we've allowed God to see into us and to have a conversation with us, then we can petition. And petition means laying your request for yourself or for others before God. And we can also call that contending. Contending is what we do when we're really, really hard pressed. Like we're in the middle of a storm. And we want to say, do you not care that we're going to drown? Those disciples were desperate. And Jesus hears us when we're desperate. He heard the disciples and he woke up and he calmed the storm, and he hears us when we're desperate. If it gets messy, if we're hard pressed, even then and especially then, Jesus hears us. He hears me and he hears you. Charles Spurgeon once said, turn into prayer everything that is care. Let your cares be the raw material of your prayers and allow them to draw us nearer to God. To be honest with him. We have to be honest with God, and we've got to do it with thanksgiving. We sung some amazing songs this morning that is better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. We've sung about rejoicing. And so often it can be really tempting if we're hard pressed or if we're in a rush to skip the thanksgiving bit and just get straight to the contending. But when we come to God with thanksgiving, in the midst of our contending, that's where we're going to find that reorientation of our circumstances. That's where we're going to take our eyes off the complexity of whatever it is that we're facing and put them back on Jesus. We're not going to receive peace if all we're looking at is pain. If we rush through straight to contending, the bad news is Paul has doubled down on that rejoicing because it really matters. We can't avoid it. If it feels strange to start your prayer time with rejoicing as you bring those requests to him, just practice. It's okay. Perfectionism gets in the way of progress. God doesn't ask us to be perfect in the way that we speak to him. He just asks us to be with him and to start speaking. God will work it out with us, and that's when we grow, and God will pour out his peace on us. So our conclusion is this. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. It's not enough to just lay down anxiety and replace it with peace. We need to replace it with something better. Spiritual wars are won and lost in the battlefields of our mind. And Paul is telling us that all those contents of our thoughts will determine the nature of our peace. To change the script of our thought life. To trade anxious thoughts for redemptive ones. The danger is not in the presence of a thought, but it's what we do with it. If we dwell on that thought, it becomes what we believe. And what we believe becomes the way that we live. And actually what we want to do is live for Christ. We want Jesus to take our hearts and minds. So we can take our thoughts captive and surrender them to Christ. And as we do this for ourselves, the invitation is also for us to do this as a church family. We want to be a non-anxious presence here in Northampton. We want to be a transformative, what's the word, Stan? Transformational community. We want to be that here in Northampton. We can't do that if we look like the world. We can't do that if we're grasped by anxiety. We want to become a bastion of peace in an anxious world. To become a people of peace where others can take refuge, to put a flag in the ground and mark out the territory of the kingdom, like those who search through the rubble at the end of a war. We want to take hold of peace and the abundant life that Jesus offers. It's not the absence of anxiety. It is the reorientation of every circumstance in the presence of Jesus. Shall we stand?